Hi everyone. My name is Ikenna Knaiwu, and today I want to present on the topic of building high-performance API platform teams. The subtitle of my talk is Beginning Lean API Governance, and this talk is really aimed at those people who are maybe beginning their API program or are looking to start implementing API governance in their API program or improve the governance of their API program. So a bit about me. I'm an independent API consultant. I focus on helping my clients solve problems around API sprawl, API drift, where there is a difference between an API and its documented behavior, API design consistency issues, and high API delivery lead times. I'm also the author of the book, Automating API Delivery, API Ops with OpenAPI. So let me just talk through the agenda of this talk. The first thing I'm going to be talking about today is what I call API delivery operating models. And then I'll talk through a kind that I've developed that I use in my practice called the IDC and how I use that to map out API delivery operating models. The third thing I'll talk about is one part of the IDC, which is about API culture. And I will focus on three things on that API culture, in that API culture area of the IDC. The first thing is the API program mission, and I will give examples of, of some good API program missions and what they look like. I will talk about API delivery scorecards of how we can collect metrics to measure progress on our API governance, on the quality of our API governance. And then the third thing I'll talk about is the API governance group, which I think is a really important, but sometimes left out aspect of ensuring good API governance. And then I will conclude the talk. And then I'll conclude the talk. So I want to start by talking about API delivery operating models. So what do I mean by an API delivery model? Well, let's start by looking at the problem. Okay, the problem, which I call the problem of API delivery at scale, is how do we structure people, processes, and technology to deliver consistent, secure, high quality APIs quickly and at scale. Okay, so how do we really bring together all the different bits in an enterprise and typical organization, large organization? How do we put together, the people, processes, technology, as we usually say, but every other thing that we need to make sure that when it comes to API, what we're delivering is high quality, is well documented, is secure. How do we make sure we have all the right things in place? And my answer to that is at scale. If you're building a platform with platform APIs, then you need an API platform team to help do that. But you also need an API delivery operating model, some sort of conceptual framework on how all these things come together. Now, what do I mean by an API platform? I mean it's a collection. I'm talking about a collection of tools, capabilities, documentation that helps support the development and developing and deploying and operating APIs. Okay, so whenever we're talking about API gateways or developer portals or API style guides, process documentation, templates, pipelines, all those things, observing, monitoring, alerting, all those things, we need all those things in place as a platform. And usually the team that oversees all these things that comprise that platform, we'll call that an API platform team, right? That's a team responsible for managing that, all those, understanding the customer needs around those and deploying, developing tools, capabilities, and providing advocacy for that platform. That'll be the platform team. So that's kind of, we know that's kind of established. But one important thing I do want to talk about in this talk is that we also need an operating model. And when I talk about operating model, I'm talking about the visualization of the people, the capabilities, the value delivery chain. How exactly is the API going to be consumed? What's that customer journey? What's the customer journey of building an API? or the not customer now, but the producer journey of building the API. What does that look like? Has that been mapped out? We really need a canvas. We really need an operating model to visualize that, and that includes knowing what technology we need to use, understanding what the scorecards are, understanding what and everything required to operationalize and implement that API strategy. So that is what an API delivery model, operating model, or ADOM is. And so this is where we are in kind of this talk. So I've started by introducing an API delivery operating model and talking about an API platform. Now I'm going to talk about a way of doing that visualization called the Ikenna Delivery Canvas, or IDC. So this is something I developed, like I said, and I use in my practice. So let me talk about how this works. So the IDC is kind of a one-page API delivery operating model. It has several main boxes at this point. It has kind of 10 boxes. So where we talk about API culture, API development, API docs and catalogs, API standards, API producer lifecycle, consumers lifecycle design, security, CI/CD, and runtime. These are the top level boxes, and these boxes actually have sub boxes within them. And I am not going to go through all of them on all the details of all those boxes in this particular talk. They're not. It's going to be too much or out of scope for this. But I'm going to focus on just one of the boxes in this talk. But I do want to point out that this kind of template is good for understanding the current state of our API delivery, and also having understood that current operating model to then map a target operating model that we want. That can be for the consumer journey, that can be for our CI/CD or API ops pipeline for the API delivery. We can use this as a way to set kind of improvement goals for our for governing our platform. And I'll just quickly mention that IDC is part of the my what I call my IGT, or my governance toolkit, which comprises a bunch of things, but which I won't go into. But this is just to say the IDC is part of a whole suite of tools that organizations can use to improve their governance. So quickly, let's go into the third part of this talk. So having talked about what an API delivery operating model is, and having talked about the IDC as a way to visualize API delivery operating models, let me now talk about one part of the IDC, which is the API culture box. And I will focus on three things in that API culture box. So the API culture box in the IDC is box 3, it's the number of the box. And it talks about it looks at the API program mission, the API delivery scorecards, if there is a governance group, an API committee of practice or support channels, and new joiner API training. These are really important aspects to make sure that organizations have sustainable API governance within their API program. Okay, and this is about making sure that those foundations in place and that they are well communicated, whether to new joiners or existing team members, making sure that those governance principles are well established. I'll start by talking about the API program box. Here, where the API program mission box, here we're asking questions like, and really for each sub box here, we will just asking questions. This canvas is about asking questions to make sure that we have the right things in place. So it's almost a combination of like some kind of checklist and a canvas. So the first thing to ask there is, what's the mission of the API program? Okay, and how does that mission, how does it tie into the business strategy? The next thing to look at there is API delivery, is API governance group, which is that, is there a central group or team responsible for enabling the creation and enforcement or communication and monitoring of those API standards? Do we have a group that monitors those API standards? We also want to look at API delivery scorecards. What are the high-level API program scorecards? And even at the team level, how are we measuring performance to our API mission? We're looking at the API community of practice. Another thing in the box is API community of practice. Is there an internal community of practice to help grow the API design and development skills of the members of development teams, and also providing them with support channels if they have API standard related questions. But we also provide new joiner training. New joiner API training is an important part of that API culture box, making sure that making sure that we're asking the question, what training is provided for new joiners to learn how the organization builds APIs. Now, I've gone through all the boxes in this kind of API culture box, or all the sub boxes in the API culture box, but I'll just focus on 3 for the rest of this talk, which is the program mission, the API delivery scorecards, and the API governance group. And so let's talk about that API program mission, which, like I said, is the first, is one of the top boxes in the API culture box. And I want to explain this by having talked about the kind of question we would ask, checklist question we would ask in that box. I want to then give you a use case, an example of where this has been done. And one example of this I really like is from NHS England. NHS England is the primary organization that oversees the planning and delivery of national health service in England, in the UK. The NHS England, has taken the time to come up with a clear definition of the problem statement for their API group program. And the way they've defined it is as follows, right? They've started by talking about the problem, and the problem that they saw when they started their API program was that interoperability in healthcare is hard. Interoperability is really difficult, and the reasons for that can come from both a technology or technical perspective, a clinical perspective, product and safety perspective. There are several reasons why that make it really hard to achieve interoperability and efficient integration in the healthcare industry. And so as part of their API program, they made it their mission. The mission of their API program was to make integration easier for everyone, whether they are external users of the APIs or the internal producers of the APIs. They wanted to provide an API platform that was a one-stop shop to make it easy to both produce and consume APIs. I really like that mindset they have, and I like to call that mindset the true customer mindset, because they wanted to make APIs not just easier for the consumers of the APIs, but easier for the producers of the APIs as well. And I like to call this the true customer mindset, because they were seeing both the consumers and the producers of the APIs as customers of their API platform. And NHS England took the time to define the benefits of the benefits the API platform will provide to their API consumers. And this included things like providing a consistent experience, using open standards, whether it was REST or FHIR, the fast healthcare interoperability resources, which is a global standard for healthcare data exchange, whether it was providing self-service access to test environments, providing clear documentation. They talked through all the things that they wanted their platform to do to make life easier for their consumers. And they also talked through all the things the platform was to do to make life easier for producers, which included things like, making, one-click API platform setup, easy setup of CI/CD pipelines, making multiple paths to live environments, great API delivery process documentation. Now, I've seen their docs. NHS England really have comprehensive documentation for API producers that answers all questions they have around. They can have around their API. What API standards should they follow? How do you deploy the APIs? All kinds of questions are really answered. They provide great docs for the API producers, not just for the API consumers. And the way they came up with defining this benefits was they did a user need analysis. So they took time to define the user needs for external developers who wanted to integrate with the APIs, but also the internal developers who need to build the APIs. And they defined, for example, the tooling that was required, and they went on to implement it. So they defined that their API gateway, their cloud provider, what cloud provider they would build both their pipelines and other services on. They came up with a bunch of tools, technology tools that was the basis for their API platform. Okay. And really focused on making these tools easy for their API producers to use to build APIs. So I think we can take a few lessons to learn. There are a few lessons we can learn from the NHS England team in terms of defining a program mission. And the very first one is, well, that mission needs to be clear. I think that mission needs to be in response to the problem that the organization has studied and seen and defined in that space. So it's important to first understand the problem around, their problem was interoperability and integration. Yours may be different, but it's good to be first clear on what the problem is that we're trying to solve, and then define a mission that is in response to that problem. But the other thing as well is to treat API consumers and producers as customers, and to research and understand those customer needs. Spend the time, do the benefit analysis to understand that, and also define the platform benefits to both those producers and consumers. So I've talked about the API delivery operating model. I've talked about how the canvas can help visualize that operating model. I've looked at one part of the canvas, which is the IDC, the API culture box, and I've talked about one thing in that box, which is the API program mission. Now let me talk about the API delivery scorecards. So what do I mean by scorecards? Again, this is the thing I showed you before, that we need to define high-level scorecards for the program. And what I see, one problem I've seen myself when working with clients and in industries, that API platform teams do not always measure API satisfaction. Okay, they don't always take time to measure how satisfied consumers. Again, we said when we're talking of the customers of the API platform, we're thinking of both users of the platform to produce the API, and then the consumers of the platform. And so what I've seen is that platform teams don't always take time to measure the satisfaction level of their customers, and because they don't do that, they lack this correcting feedback mechanism, because measuring those satisfaction levels really help organizations kind of go back and then optimize or improve. So where that's not being done, then yeah, that feedback mechanism is not going to be in place. And what does this then mean? Well, it means that there's going to be a very poor API producer experience or a very poor API consumer experience, okay? Whether it's in terms of documentation or quality issues with the API or something else. And the way to counteract this is to measure API satisfaction, whether on the consumer side, on the producer side. I want to give a few case studies of where this has been done. So this is a survey that I helped do for a client of mine. I did for a client of mine, where we measured the satisfaction in this case for a very specific area, which is on designing and building APIs for the organization. We talked to the developers across different teams on how satisfied they are with building and designing APIs. So we asked them that, but we also asked them from the consumption side, how satisfied were they with integrating with the organization's APIs. And so somewhere we see that varying level. Some decided to be in the middle, and where people are in the middle with neither satisfied or dissatisfied, we usually went in with further questions in user interviews to drill down and really uncover things that maybe they couldn't say clearly in a survey that just has 5 points on a Likert scale. We would drill in and ask questions, and that really uncovered issues with the APIs or with the API delivery operating model, with their processes, with the people, with the technology that needed to be addressed. So this kind of survey again is really good to uncover some of those qualitative issues, if you like, with how satisfied people are with the API. The other thing is about, I did it as well, is a case study of an organization I worked with, kind of a fintech organization, where, again, simply mentioning satisfaction. And this time we said, how satisfied are you with the design review process? This particular organization had issues with their API design review process, and things were getting stuck for weeks, waiting review by some sort of centralized API review team. And so this kind of survey over time, this is just a snapshot, but we did do this in several iterations. As we measured this, we would make improvements, we'll measure again, and it really helped improve. It really helped improve things by providing that measurable progress to see how things were being improved, and people were getting more satisfaction was increasing, or getting more satisfied with the improvements in the API and how APIs were being built. And finally, I'll end with this example from NHS England as well. They've been measuring their what they call their overall API management customer satisfaction. They've been doing this for several years, and the information is public. The results of their survey is public. You can see how it's gone from 2.3 in 2020 to 3.78 in 2023, the kind of average score. And they measure these metrics across different levels. They call it learning, design and build, testing, onboarding, help and support, and then some sort of overall score. What these different aspects mean is that there are really different sections of the survey where they ask questions, about that particular, if it's learning, about learning the API, or design and build, again, about design and building the API. They have several questions in those categories. You can have a look at the there's a whole, if you go to the NHS England, they have a page on the internet where you can go and see the survey results across different years. And just playing this, you can see some of the statements as well that people give, qualitative statements people give, and how they track this result. So it's a really good way of this really highlights the importance of capturing that API satisfaction to help enable improvements in that area. So a few lessons we can take from there is, use surveys, to measure that API satisfaction, but don't you stick to just surveys, do those interviews to really explore and uncover the finer shades, explore things that people wouldn't necessarily put on surveys, to uncover any aspects of your operating model that is causing issues for both providers and consumers of the APIs, and also use that as a baseline for improvements, going forward. But run this at a cadence, run this, have some sort of regular cadence for running this, even if it's once every year. Do this so you have that correcting feedback mechanism. Now I'll go on to the third point, which is about the API governance group. Again, within that API culture box, and like I said, I'm talking about three things. I've talked about program mission, delivery scorecards, and now I'll talk about the governance group. So the governance group, now the problem I've seen with this is that organizations where API standards are poorly defined, it's usually because an API governance group does not exist, or is not functioning properly. It may exist, but it's not functioning properly. It might be too a little bit, maybe too even overbearing and being a blocker, or it might not be there, or it might not be effective enough, and then you have lots of design inconsistencies. So where an API governance group doesn't exist or is not functioning properly, we can end up with inconsistent API design, lots of poor API discovery, or poor API discovery. These are symptoms of that issue. And one way to counteract this is to really create an API governance group. Yes, it should be cross-functional, and there are different techniques I'll talk about we can use to improve it. But it's to first make sure we have a governance group that is functioning properly. I want to talk about an example of this with a client of mine that I did some work for, and really the organization was looking to introduce automation across how they build APIs, but we found out that they didn't really have a governance group, to begin with. And that's where we started. We started by creating a governance group, making sure it had representation from developers, from architecture teams, from the DevOps or from the platform teams. In this time, we didn't quite get some of from security, even though we wanted that. And then we had someone we call an API enabler to come and to kind of lead the group. So forming this was the kind of first step or foundation to then do start any automation initiative or any other standards defining initiative, API style guides or anything like that. We needed to do this first. And so sorry. And so once we've done that, now I do have a template I use called the A3 template, which is really a problem-solving template that we use to guide improvements around when we're improving our APIs, and that's in this project. That's what we use to help the organization start introducing automation, but also measure the impact of that automation and making sure it was actually improving the lead time, making sure it was improving the quality of the API standards, API discovery, and things like that. So there are tools like that the governance group can use. The second thing I want to mention is AEPs, which is API enhancement proposals, and these are style guides, pretty much style guides or a style guide format you can find by going to aep.dev. It's a kind of open source style guide format you can use and adapt for your needs. I have an adaptation of this for myself. I use in my practice. I call them ASPs, API standard proposals. But regardless, it's always useful to have these standards that can be the basis of discussion. Teams can take them, modify them to fit their needs, and adapt them and use them. Really good to drive those standards. And so, but the important thing is, this is something that the governance group does, okay? As a cross-functional group, they do not just one person, because when the group does it, a good cross-functional group, it gives the group has ownership. It's something that they've come up with, they've approved, they've recommended, and it gives them ownership, and it can help them drive that and advocate for that in the organization. So we can say that, ensure you have an API governance group in place. Use a metric-driven approach like the A3 to drive API standards, improvements. And don't write an API style guide from scratch or even use AI to generate one. The AEP is great, API enhancement proposals. Go to aep.dev, take a look at that, and see how you can use that for your needs. There are other API style guides there you can adapt, modify, and obviously the governance group, have that governance group advocate an API and advocate for standards. And so I'm going to conclude. I've come to the end. I just want to conclude the this. I've talked through all this about API delivery operating models and how important it is to have a one-page canvas that explains all the things you need to talk about: API security, API culture, your API consumption journey, your API production journey, your API design, the CI/CD pipeline of your observability and monitoring for your APIs, all the things you need, which is visualized on my IDC canvas, all the things you need to think about for your APIs, and also having and the IDC also sounds like a checklist to making sure you're thinking about all these things, but then also focusing on these three big things about API culture: your program mission, how you're going to measure success with delivery scorecards, and your governance group to help shepherd those standards across the organization. So that's really the conclusion that's really the conclusion. I'll just skip through this because I've talked through this, but yeah, do define the metrics. Do define the metrics using your scorecards and so on. So thank you very much for listening to my talk. Do follow me on LinkedIn, and if you do subscribe to my newsletter, there are kind of tip sheets and things like that I give to people who subscribe to the newsletter around API governance. It's a great resource. Also great resources for people interested in API governance. And here's a few references for the talk if you do get the slides from the API Days website. So thank you very much. Thank you for listening to my talk.